from the engaging humour path, and his speech title is Identifying People on the Autism Spectrum. Timing is 18 to 22 minutes. Please welcome William.
Thank you, Madam Toastmaster. I have been really busy this past weekend because I've been involved in so many different shindigs. For example, I was up in St. Augustine for a barbershop convention, and our Gainesville chorus competed, and we had the unusual ability to sing in two keys at the same time. So much for harmony, but we had a good time at it, and we got to have a good time singing. But the funny story is, as a kid, there were two things I really hated: getting a haircut and singing. So it's odd that I got involved with barbershop. But of course, this barbershop convention, there wasn't much haircutting going on. It was a different kind of barbershop. But as a kid, something that my mother tells me about is this time when I actually had to go get a haircut. She took me to the hairdresser and they sat me down in the chair and started working with those scissors. But I went into absolute meltdown mode. Like my brain being a computer, it crashed. I did not want to have my haircut. And so my mother, she was very concerned. And the lady cutting hair said, "You know what? Let's have you come back on Thursday at 6." And so she took me home and brought me back to the hairdresser on Thursday at 6, only to see a sign on the door saying Monday through Friday, 10 to 5. That's how bad I was. She ended up cutting my hair at home. Now, as an adult, getting a haircut has been a little more easy for the person who's cutting my hair, but it's sometimes a bit more challenging because I have no idea what I want when I go in for that haircut. But usually it's just, oh, just whatever I had last time, whatever that was. Although there have been times when I come to a hairdresser and the sign on the door says, in fact, they are closed, especially during 2020. And the other thing I said I hated as a kid was singing. Not singing myself, but other people singing. Like the baritone and the barbershop quartet. All these random notes that just hurt the ears when heard by themselves. And because of that, there was something else I really hated as a kid. Birthdays. I hated birthdays because of the singing and the candles, and even at kindy, which is what in New Zealand we call kindergarten, they wanted to have a birthday celebration for me, but I didn't want them to sing, but they eventually let me into it. Because as you see, I am on the autism spectrum. When I was very young, everyone thought I was just going to be a regular kid. I was going to go to school, I was going to have friends, I was going to have a very normal life. But those teachers had no idea what they were in for with me. I couldn't do eye contact. I had an intense phobia for very random things. And of course, I had which is a very typical sign of autism, an unusual obsession with all things to do with trains. All kinds of trains. The highlight of my day after kindy was coming home to watch Thomas the Tank Engine. I knew all the engines. There was Thomas, there was Henry, Percy, there was also Bertie, who wasn't a train, but Bertie was the bus. And I had toy trains. I had model trains. I pushed that little Duplo toy train around the track many, many times, and until my brother came in and started playing with it and got me upset. I loved anything to do with trains. I loved taking the train to get into the city. At the zoo, we got to see the elephants, the giraffes, the zebras, but they had a train there too. And I loved riding that little train. Even if it just went round in circles, I love that little thing. They did some therapies on me, many of which were not successful, including forced eye contact therapy, which was probably more traumatizing than helpful, although it wasn't totally traumatizing because they were able to convince me with a toy train. So, some you might be wondering, how do you recognize someone who is on the autism spectrum? When you think of autism, you might think of people like Rain Man. Who here seen Rain Man? Yeah, okay, so quite a few of you. You know that Rain Man is a character who has some very stringent regimens. He won't want to go to a regular shindig because it's out of his way of thinking. It's his way of his routines that get disrupted. And he has some very unusual mannerism. He goes into meltdown modes. He refuses to wear any clothes unless it's bought at a Kmart. Well, good luck finding a Kmart these days, Mr. Rayan. But not to worry, he can still catch a Qantas flight to Melbourne, and there are Kmart's in Melbourne. And of course, we also know about people like Temple Grandin, who is famous for her work with animals and making sure the animals are treated humanely through her systems of managing livestock. And in fact, there are some people that many believe are on the spectrum, they just haven't come forward with it. People think Einstein, the famous scientist who discovered relativity. We have Bill Gates, the inventor of Microsoft and Windows and all the frustrations that we get with it. And some even suspect that Elon Musk might be on the spectrum. Because, it's one thing to design an electric car and launch rockets into space, or launching electric cars on rockets into space. But when it comes to social skills, I don't know what he did to the social network Twitter, but some people suspect he could be on the spectrum. But that's not the whole story when it comes to identifying people on the spectrum. Simple fact is, our brains are often wired up a bit differently from most people. It's like a computer, and for people on the autism spectrum, the computer that makes up our brain is configured a bit differently from the brain in most people. Just like any computer, we have a memory, we have a processing, we have our input and output. We might have a different operating system that's running on top. Think about a desktop operating system like Windows or Macintosh. Then you have your smartphone operating systems. You have iPhone, you have Android, or if some of you are really old school, you might have a Palm Pilot or even a BlackBerry. I don't know if anyone still uses those, but they were designed and they have the unique ability to do things in their own unique way. They can be a lot more power efficient, and they might not be the fastest things around, but they will do the job and you can take it with you. Whereas a high-end computing workstation can do all these different things with very fancy graphics. But then, of course, being on the autism spectrum, just like a computer, our brains sometimes crash. Sometimes they get something that's not designed for it. Think about trying to do a spreadsheet on a smartphone. You could do it, but it's a bit cumbersome. So what I'd like to tell you about is some ways that you can identify a person who's what you call neurodiverse. The classic way of doing it is through what they call the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM. Now, DSM is the gold standard for identifying people who are, in fact, on the spectrum. But I think I might know better sometimes when it comes to that, because the DSM criteria says absolutely nothing in it about trains. And of course, an obsession with trains, that's one of the classic signs of autism. Not unique, not exclusively, but people on the autism spectrum tend to gravitate towards trains, whether it's Thomas the Tank Engine, whether it's metro systems or classic steam engines. And so I went on, did a little bit of research about some of the other things that make up the special interests that a lot of people on the spectrum have. So I went to Google and I looked at what are some of the most common interests that people on the spectrum have. And sure enough, Google said trains. Okay, yeah, I knew it already. Maps. Yeah, okay. You know, that's a subway map behind me. Animals. Yeah. Video games. Also, you can probably see the NES that's right behind me. And also comic books. So and comic books don't really appeal to me, but they do appeal to a lot of other people on the autism spectrum. I've been to conventions that cater towards people on the autism spectrum, and a lot of the conversation comes to comic books, also anime, and for example, Pokemon, which is also a video game in some senses. But every person on the autism spectrum is likely to have a special interest. They could have multiple special interests. And whether it could be trains and airplanes, it could be maps and animals, video games. And in fact, I have had several special interests of my own, whether it is also, I've had several interests in things like amusement parks and riding on roller coasters, also airplanes, boats, anything that moves. Cars, not so much, but definitely large vehicles. And speaking of vehicles, another way that you can find out if someone's on the spectrum is judging the way they drive. Or maybe they don't drive at all. Because a lot of people on the autism spectrum don't drive at all because driving can be a bit challenging for them. And they might go into sensory overload because roads are not designed to cater to people on the autism spectrum. Neither are cars. And if they do drive, there is actually another telltale sign that someone who is driving is on the autism spectrum. And that is just to think about the way they drive. If you go down the highway, you see a sign. It says speed limit, 70 miles per hour. How fast do you go? Someone want to tell me how fast do you go when you see that speed limit sign?
78.
78. Yeah, okay. So you are probably not on the spectrum because as someone on the spectrum, you see that sign, you think, okay, the speed limit is 70 miles per hour, so you should go 70 miles per hour. And sometimes you have to learn to drive like a neurotypical, and that means doing 78 when the sign actually says 70. It doesn't make any sense, but everyone's doing 78 and the 70 mile per hour zone. That stop sign. Someone on the spectrum, complete stop. Someone who's not on the spectrum, slow down to a crawl and then speed up again. Once you check the coast is clear. So driving, that's another thing that makes it difficult for people on the spectrum. Now, of course, if the world was designed for people who are on the spectrum, we wouldn't have cars instead. We would have lots of trains. We'd probably have some airplanes. We might have some massive boats, maybe some spaceships, and there'll be clear maps that will tell us where to go. So we'd have our own ways of getting around, even if it's just walking. And of course, the other way that you can find out if someone is on the autism spectrum is to find out if they want to work on self-improvement. And what better way to do self-improvement than to go to Toastmasters? And mind you, Toastmasters might not be the ideal shindig for everyone, but it is a way for someone to come out of their shell. Toastmasters has changed me quite a bit, made me a lot more comfortable when it comes to talking to people. And if you want to get them to a Toastmasters, then they actually make it to the meeting and they're not totally overwhelmed, there are some ways that you can get that information about them. First off, they'd have to give their icebreaker. And if they successfully give their icebreaker, there's a good chance they will even self-disclose that they are on the autism spectrum. I, in fact, know a few people who have done that in my home club, Talking Gators. We had a young man who's in law school now, but he came right off the bat. He was very vocal about being on the autism spectrum. Another young man that I've been working with, he also mentioned that he was on the spectrum, and he was really intelligent when it came to what I was talking about. Now, if the icebreaker goes completely off the wall and they don't disclose that they're on the autism spectrum, but then they go off on a tangent about trains, airplanes, or video games, there's a good chance that they will be someone who is, in fact, on the spectrum. They might give multiple speeches about the same things. I remember my second or third speech, I talked about video games, and as a foreshadowing of becoming a DTM, I in fact went over time. And speaking of going over time, another way to tell if someone's on the autism spectrum is to make them the grammarian. Because if you even think about having a grammatical error in your speech, they will know about it and they will tell you about it. That young man I was talking to you about earlier, who self-disclosed when he came to a Talking Gators meeting, we had asked him to be the grammarian, and he found all sorts of different things. Sure, he might not be the most successful in living by himself, and of course he doesn't know how to drive, or he cannot drive, but he was very finely detailed when it came to his grammarian's report. And as I said, going over time is something that it's not just for DTMs. If you give someone on the autism spectrum the role of the grammarian, they will keep going and going and going. And finally, another factor that will help you identify someone on the autism spectrum is how closely they follow the agenda. If the meeting's scheduled to start at 6, they will start that meeting at 6. If table topics must end at 6:37, they will make sure that table topic session's at 6:37. And if the Toastmaster fails to call for a timers report, that person will let them know that, hey, you got to do the timers report. So Toastmasters is actually quite a natural fit for people on the autism spectrum. And in fact, there are even some clubs that are designed to cater to those sorts of people. There's the Neurodiverse Leadership Club that I've visited a few times, and they do things in ways that cater to people on the autism spectrum. And even Talking Gators, although it's a regular Toastmasters club, they have a few people, even the charter member who is on the autism spectrum, and she has a doctoral degree. So overall, people on the autism spectrum are quite diverse. They have a lot of unique abilities, sometimes disabilities. For example, for me, I cannot do faces very well, but they can do some fairly amazing things that would help society overall. And of course, if you get someone in Toastmasters or you get someone on the spectrum to join Toastmasters, they can be very successful. And in conclusion, think about someone you might know who could be on the autism spectrum and bring them to a Toastmasters meeting. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, William. That was a wonderful speech, very enlightening. I learned a lot about autism. I also learned why I really don't like grammarian or doing the timing. So it's wonderful to be able to identify with, the bits that aren't that. But really, really, really good, very honest. I really enjoyed the talk, and humorous. And the trains. My little grandson has so many trains. His mother's a psychologist, so I'm going to have a word to her about that. So thank you very much. Really enjoyed William's talk.